Hello everyone. My research in progress focuses on how to govern shadow gen AI in clinical workflow, especially in the settings where ambient AI scribes and related documentation tools are being used within or alongside clinical decision support system. The central idea here is that as an ambient AI scribe spreads, organization they need more governance. That is real-time workflow integrated and trust supportive and they which are not just policy based or retrospective. So moving on to the second slide here, which is the research problem. The problem that I'm trying to address is that generative AI is entering healthcare workflows faster than governance mechanisms are keeping up. In particularly, shadow gen AI, it refers to unofficial, unmonitored, or lightly governed use of these tools, and that creates risks around documentation quality, accountability, and clinical trust. This matters because ambient AI scribe can be helpful, but they can also omit, misstate, or hallucinate content if the surrounding governance is weak. The next slide here is why now. So I think this topic is especially timely because policies and practices are converging. On the policy side, the HDI rule increased transparency expectations for predictive decision support in certified health IT, including requirements related to training data, intended use, validation, fairness, and also maintenance. And on the other side, ambient AI scribe are becoming more common, so healthcare systems need governance approaches that are scalable and which are also embedded in their workflow. Moving on to the next slide here, which is the research objective and question. So my objective is to design and evaluate a governance artifact that can detect shadow gen AI use, generative dynamic explanation, and also captures clinicians' feedback within documentation workflow. So my research question here is how can a socio-technical governance artifact or shadow Gen AI in clinical decision support workflow uses dynamic explanations and clinicians' feedback loops to improve trust calibration, documentation quality, workflow fit, and safe ambient scribing. So the next slide here is theoretical grounding. This study is grounding in two main lenses. First is the socio-technical systems theory, which is important because healthcare AI does not succeed based on model performance alone. It must fit users' task flow and organization context. The second is I use trust calibration literature because the goal in clinical AI is not to maximize trust building, but to support appropriate reliance through usability, explanation, and visible limits. Moving on to the next slide, which is the DSR artifact. The proposed DSR artifact is a socio-technical governance model and workflow integrated design architect for managing shadow gen AI in clinical documentation, and it also care gap support. It has four components. The first one is detection layer to identify unofficial or unimproved Gen AI use. Second is dynamic explanation layer, which shows the rationale and source cues and also uncertainty flags. The third is clinical feedback that captures edits, rejects, and common behavior. The fourth is the governance dashboard that aggregates usage, override, and quality signal for oversight. The next one is the behavioral logic. One important point is that governance is not only a technical issue. So this artifact is designed to balance technical control with human behavior. Detection and explanation make AI activity visible, but the feedback loop is what turns clinical judgments into part of governance processes. In other words, the system is not just watching clinicians, it is learning from their responses and support trust rather than acting as a rigid surveillance mechanism. Moving on to the evaluation design. So for my initial evaluation, I propose using ambient scribe stimulations. I choose these settings because it is realistic enough to reflect actual documentation workflow, but they are controlled enough to compare conditions. For example, I can compare baseline ambient scribing with static explanations, and also ambient scribing with governance integrated dynamic explanations, along with the feedback it captures. That allows me to evaluate not just technical output, but also users' responses and governance fit. Moving on to the next slide, which is what will be measured. So the main construct I plan to assess are trust, calibration, documentation quality, governance usability, care gap support usefulness, and also workflow fit. I also want to observe the behavioral signals such as acceptance, editing, overrides, and corrections. This is important because if clinicians constantly override or heavily revise content, that tells us something meaningful about both explanation quality and governance design. So, measurement in this study is not only about whether the AI works, but whether the governance artifact supports appropriate use. Moving on to the expected contribution, I see three contribution. The first one is a DSR contribution because the study defines a concrete artifact class for governing shadow gen AI in clinical workflow. The second contribution I see is a theory contribution because it connects socio-technical systems, thinking and trust calibrations to explain and feedback design. The third is the practical contribution because it offers healthcare systems a governance approach that goes beyond static policies and move towards scalable and real-time oversight. The next slide is the next steps. My next steps are to define the artifact specification, translate it into clearer workflow and interface logic, and develop ambient scribe stimulation scenarios. After that, I will operationalize the core measures, especially trust calibration, node quality, workflow fit, and governance usability. Then I can align the write-up presentation more tightly with the AMCIS expectation for in research and process paper. So to close, the main argument of this project is that shadow gen AI governance in healthcare should be treated as a socio-technical design problem, not just a compliance problem. If organizations want safe and scalable gen AI deployment, especially for ambient documentation, they need governance that can detect use, explain output, capture clinicians' judgment, and support appropriate trust in real time. That is the purpose of this artifact that I'm proposing. Thank you so much. I will take any questions that you have in the comments below. Bye bye.